This is the Microsoft Cloud Show, episode 87. Today, we're going to interview Paul Schaeflein and catch up on Azure Active Directory and identity stuff. Recorded live July the 8th, 2015. Welcome to the Microsoft Cloud Show, the only place to stay up to date on everything going on in the Microsoft Cloud world, including Windows Azure, Office 365, SharePoint, Exchange, Link, and related technologies. Just the information, no marketing, no BS. I'm Andrew Connell.
And I'm Chris Johnson.
And we're just two dudes telling you how we see it. Good day, CJ. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Thank you, AC. Not too bad.
Awesome.
Getting ready for WPC.
That's, I guess that's next week?
It is. Yes, I'm going down to, how do I say this without being rude?
Oh, you are not going to do it. Are you really?
Sweaty Orlando.
Oh, okay. That's good. At least you're not going to make a detour out to the coast, are you?
I've taken the 5th.
Oh, you're a bastard. Are you really? Are you going over to the Kennedy Space Center?
I don't know if I can yet.
Oh, good.
I don't know if I've got the time, but I will be at the drop of a hat hiring a car and scooting out there if I do.
I hope that you can't go. Haha. Because I want
to go and have a little alone time with Atlantis.
I'm hoping to use that as a bartering chip to get you to come down to the SP Live 360 conference that's going to be in Orlando in November. We got a really good lineup that's lined up there. So if anybody is interested, I've got a lot of really good speakers and really good content lined up that Matt McDermott and I, another SharePoint or Office 365 MVP, that he and I are the co-chairs for the SharePoint part of the conference. It's a VS Live conference, and this was kind of branded as SP Live 360.
Yep.
And at that show, Matt and I we brought together a lot of really good people for a good show, but we've still got some openings available that are primarily set aside so that we can bring some additional people in, like for some late breaking or more recent news stuff that you guys may release over the summer.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, it looks like be a fun show. And hey, you can always go to the Cape to go see some rockets while you're there.
Exactly, man. Everybody should come down and do that, and hopefully SpaceX will be flying again by then, and they've figured out what their problem is, what the problem that they had, the rocket that they lost a week or two ago. But
they have figured it out?
No, they haven't. They're still.
They haven't yet. Yeah.
Elon Musk was at an event last night, and they asked him some stuff, and he's like, "I know there's media in the room, so I'm just going to say it like this."
Yeah, exactly.
So you can tell that they're confused. They're like, the data that they have
doesn't make a lot of sense to them or something.
No, it really doesn't. It's confusing because it implies something very straightforward when it wasn't straightforward. So
yeah, that's tough. Gosh, it's like diagnosing a rover on Mars, when you can't just sort of reach out and give it a 3-finger salute and reboot it, or grab logs off it very easily or whatever. It must be really hard to diagnose that stuff.
Yeah. So at any rate, they're trying to figure it out. But
yeah.
Hey, we're going to keep this one, the beginning of this show, kind of quick here, because I actually sat down with Paul Schaeflein a couple weeks ago. We were at the SP TechCon Dev Days conference in San Francisco, and Paul and I caught up after we actually did a discussion back in December of 2014.
Oh, right.
It was episode number 60, where the two of us, we talked a lot about Azure Active Directory and identity and how it relates to Office 365 and just in general. And I mean, hey, the Azure guys are going crazy, so we figured let's get together and let's just do a catch up on what's new.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, Paul's a great friend of the show, and it's fantastic for him to give us some of his time to talk to us about this stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. So Paul and I sat down. We talked for a good 40 minutes or so about the different authentication or OAuth flows that are, I guess another way to look at it is ways of getting an access token that Azure AD supports. We talked about Azure AD Premium. We did a bit of a mea culpa on OWIN, because neither one of us were terribly clear on it when we talked about it last December. Now we are both experts at it, and so we wanted to make sure we cleared up, kind of had a mea culpa that we could go back to.
Nice.
And we actually found some really good documentation too that we wanted to share with people as well from the Azure site, and a whole developer portal that's kind of like how you guys have set up a developer portal for a developer site for Office 365. So.
Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah. So it's pretty cool stuff. So at any rate, why don't we go ahead and roll the episode or roll the interview here and just take it from there.
Sounds good.
Hope you enjoy this, guys. Okay, I'm sitting here in San Francisco. This is Andrew on June the 26th, 2015 with Paul Schaeflein. Paul, how's it going?
It's going great.
Yeah, we are both here for in a hotel in San Francisco for the SP TechCon Dev Days first show. What did you think about the show this week?
I liked it. Of course, I always like the more heavier developer-focused one like Evo and stuff. It's nice to just get really geeky out and talk stuff that everyone shakes their head about.
Exactly, yeah. When everybody's doing dev, you don't feel like there's some people that are going to find IT Pro or finding end-user stuff. It's nice to where everybody, is kind of, we've all been self-selected as just doing dev stuff. So I really hope they do more of these shows. It's just, it was there's not a dedicated like SharePoint / Office 365 dev show except for this one now, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. Although, I did an Office 365 dev camp back in Chicago a week or so ago, and it was nice, the same kind of thing. You would just get a bunch of developers together. It was like the early days of the user groups when everyone had a lot of excitement, and it was, I definitely like the dev-focused events. It's really fun.
Absolutely. So, hey, before we dive too much into this, go ahead and introduce yourself. People don't know who you are, and make sure that you let everybody know where can they find you, where can they reach you.
Yeah, so Paul Schaeflein. I live in Chicago, Illinois. My blog or my website is schaeflein.net. And, Twitter is Paul Schaeflein, and those who know me know that it's the Twitters. So I'm kind of known for doing the doddering old man approach to these social networks, but I'm on all of them when I have the free time. So yeah, and
the free times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so I've been a long time developer and SharePoint developer, or way back in the day, and training and consulting for all things Office and web and
So you're doing more Office 365 and Azure AD work and Azure work these days, huh?
Yeah. And
got your head stuck in the clouds.
My head is in the clouds, absolutely. And identity's always been a fun focus for me, so I'm doing that. And so I'm helping a bunch of clients, onboard to Office 365. Identity is always a big issue, and how do I manage it and take care of it and get started? And so there's a lot of things to think about and consideration. So I've been doing that now. I'm on my third large enterprise client doing the same kind of work. It's a lot of fun, and I really like it.
Cool. That's cool. Yeah. So, hey, last time we sat down, I should say go Blackhawks, right? Especially for Jeremy Thaik there.
Yes.
Give him a little needle right there. It's our shows. We can do that, right?
Absolutely, yes. My hometown hockey team is champions again. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. It was funny because for everybody listening, so nobody understands why I'm a Blackhawk fan, but I grew up really close friends with a family who was also from Chicago or had a strong Chicago allegiance, and they were big Blackhawk fans. And so growing up, even in Florida, I was a Blackhawk fan. So everyone's like, yeah, you should like the Lightning. I'm like, no, I like the freaking Blackhawks. And so I always got grief, and everybody's like, well, you just like them because they're doing good. I'm like, no, I've liked them forever. But it was funny because during the playoffs, there was one or two times when I started texting you before a game, like going, hey, yeah, it's going to be great. We text during the game, and the Blackhawks lost, and I was like, I'm not talking to you before or after or during a game until the game's over.
Yeah.
So these games would end so late sometimes, especially with that Duck series, or the late, like the overtime games.
Triple overtimes, yeah.
We're sitting there texting at midnight my time or 1 a.m. It's like going, great game. Like, yeah, I'm going to bed. Like, me too.
Yeah, it's lots of fun, and I can attest he has been a Blackhawk fan since I've known him, which is before the bandwagon got rather large. So absolutely.
So, hey, last time we talked, you and I, we sat down and we did a podcast. I can't remember what episode it was, but it was back in November of 2014.
Yeah.
We linked up at the, the SP Live 360 in Orlando.
Yep, we're in Orlando at Poolside, yeah.
Poolside, that's right, yeah. And we're going to do it again this year.
Yes,
right? So
yeah.
we got a lot of good stuff at that show. So if you're interested, definitely come on down to Orlando. It'll be a lot of fun. A lot of really good people down there. We got a really good conference lined up. A lot of really good speakers. Really good content and a lot of forward-facing stuff. So I even held back a few slots for stuff that's going to be kind of leaked and announced and stuff between now and then. So.
It's interesting because Microsoft has said repeatedly, they have this kind of semi-annual push of new stuff that's coming out.
Yeah,
and
they call it a moment.
Yeah, the last one was April or May, so 6 months later is November. Look at that.
They said the next one's going to be in October. So right beforehand, so I'm like, I want to make sure I got some stuff kind of squared away to kind of open it up and we can say some stuff. But
that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, but so when we sat down, I gotta do a little bit of a mea culpa here because when we sat down, I didn't understand as much Azure AD as I did. And so we're going to talk about Azure AD today and identity stuff and kind of a revisit of what's new, what's happened since we talked. But when we sat down back in November of last year, we talked a little bit about something called OWIN. And I asked you some questions and you gave some answers, and I wasn't really clear, and I gave some weird answers to it as well. So I kind of want to do I know what I'm talking about now, so can we go back? So do you want to give your perspective on what it is?
Yes, right. So what I communicate a lot now to developers is that you hear about OWIN and Katana, which is the code word that was used for it. And the first thing I have to point out to them is it's not an authentication framework, right? The OWIN is Open Web Interface for .NET, and I like to compare it to the pipeline we had in ASP.NET web forms, where you could put modules and handlers and stuff in the pipeline to execute code before the page was run. And so that's a similar thing now. If you're using OWIN, you'll write code in apps, the start. I'm drawing a blank now with the app start
auth.
Startup
auth. Yeah.
The startup. So you do a startup class instead of a global.asax, right? Yeah. So it's and in that you will then load up modules to do various things. The most common is, of course, authentication.
Yeah.
And then, and if you look, there's example, and we can talk about examples later, but you'll see the typical practice would be in OWIN, I would say, hey, I want to use cookies to persist, the identity, during the session. And then how the cookie gets issued is by some, code that maybe would talk to Azure AD to do authentication. So you can use OWIN to do the authentication, but it doesn't do it itself. So
you can set it up to it recognizes certain patterns. Like when something comes in, there's a notification. I recognize a pattern, then it's an auth code that's coming in. So what do I do with this auth code when it comes in, and how do I handle it, and how do I cache it, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, right. So that's the OWIN framework, right? Then of course the flows that you mentioned, the events happening, which is we should probably talk about because that's changed a bit too. But yeah, so it's really the OWIN is just like the framework, if you will, the interface. Then you have to do some implementations, and of course you could, if you want to do FBA type implementation, if you are so inclined, or just use NTLM. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure your app, your MVC app, if you will, is doing, or your web API is doing that type of authentication work, and that's the framework to do it.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of understand when you first start to see it. I was talking to some of the guys from Microsoft about this recently, where one of the frustrations I have is with I still think auth is one of the hardest things for people to really get their brain wrapped around. Once you understand the basics of it, it really isn't that hard. But if you don't get it and you just kind of plug your way through it and assume things, then what you find is that if you try and jump into Office 365 APIs, you can just copy some code, paste it in, kind of follow a lab here and there. But then the first time something doesn't work, you're kind of looking at the code like, I have no idea what I'm doing here. I don't get what any of this stuff is. Because it doesn't get authentication context and authentication result. What does this work? And it gets frustrating. So, so I think it's first people need to understand really what the flow looks like. I'm using the word flow, and I really shouldn't right now, but you need to understand how the authentication process works, and then look to something like this and how does OWIN help you with this, and understand at the time, we hadn't talked about it in the podcast, but in our episode that we did, but there was a demo that Rob Howard had done that showed the whole process using just the browser and Fiddler to get the authorization code, to get the access token, and then to use that to make a call against some sort of protected endpoint and protected resource. And once I saw that, it opened up my eyes to how the whole thing worked. And I started showing that demo to other people, and they're like, okay, I get it. Rob Howard is one of the main identity guys for Office 365 and SharePoint. So he's for Microsoft.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But and one of the pluses, when you start an app and this authentication flow happens at the very beginning, and then once it's successful, the browser just subsequent requests happen with a cookie. So if it's going to fail, it fails right away.
Yeah, and then you're good.
Yeah, so you figure it out before you even get started. So that's usually kind of helpful. But
it's nice. Fail early and fail. Hopefully not.
Fail fast.
It's not often. Fail early and fail fast.
Yes.
So you can deal with it. But So at the time when we did this, when we talked about this stuff, there was really, I guess the way I like to explain this to people is that with Azure AD, when you're trying to get authentication stuff, the number one thing you have to do is you have to get you got to get an access token, right? That's everything. The keys to the kingdom.
That's the end game, right?
That's the end game. You need an access token because that's the one thing you need to talk to a secured endpoint. And the trick is always, how do I get it? And at the time we talked, we really only had one option that was supported by Office 365 and Azure AD, and that was what's called the authorization code flow.
Well, we also have, to confuse matters, the SharePoint provider hosted app, which is similar but different enough to cause confusion. So yeah.
So it's,
exactly.
And since then, what they did is, I think the Azure AD team in late 2014, like December or December 2014, January 2015, something like that. They introduced a new flow, and then we got another one in February. So the one that they announced the first one they announced was called the client credentials flow. So do you want to explain what that one is a little bit?
Yes. So what we started with, right? So I'm going to go back to provider hosted app days when the flow, if you will, was initiated in SharePoint. I click on an icon in SharePoint, and the context token would be issued to your app, and you would use that to communicate with somebody to get your access token. And now in Office 365, we're not in SharePoint to begin with, right? So we're somewhere else, and that's where we start with this code where our app would knock on the door and say, hey, I want to make this connection, and the code is to help to start the process, right? And so now this client credential one also has another term called app only or server processor daemon with the A in the word, like the Linux guys would do it.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of a misnomer. I like to say app only is really the context of the authentication that's happening. But the idea here is that instead of a user saying, here, I want to have this app do work on my behalf, the app itself wants to do something, and so the app has to have credentials, and so that's the credential flow because your app has credentials.
Yeah, not in the context of the user. It can be,
right.
It can be, but it really is. You're really using it for the app to either act on its behalf with no user interaction, or to have a higher level of permissions, a higher level of be more permissive than what the user can actually do.
Exactly, right. The infamous run with elevated privilege method in SharePoint on-prem. Yeah, run with scissors. Run with scissors method, absolutely. And so that's because there's some valid scenarios, and I like to always say, you're going to record, vacation requests. So you have a vacation list, but you don't want everybody in the company to go and be able to modify it because Andrew's off today, and I go delete his record. Now he's playing hooky instead of on vacation. So maybe I have an app that'll update that list on my behalf. So there's some valid scenarios there, and this client credentials approach is a perfect way to do that, where I can make sure the app is doing something on behalf of the user, and the audit trail and the server. Office 365 or SharePoint Online will, when you do it in that fashion, if there's a user context involved, they record the user context, or if there is no user context involved, they'll just note that it's the app only, so you can tell how this change was accomplished and give you some visibility into that. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And then earlier today we discovered the recent discovery. So client credentials initially was usually certificate.
Yeah.
And on SharePoint on-prem, that's the high trust server to server.
Yeah.
But when you're in Azure Active Directory, your application can have a high secret, which is a password, or a certificate.
So you have the option to use either one, and it just depends.
Yeah.
It's nice because customers can choose what they want to do. Secrets, probably a little bit easier for the developers to mess with and everything, but certificates, you have a better way of installing it on the server and that kind of stuff and protecting it.
Yeah, and so there's a kind of a hidden gotcha that you'll see that these client secrets expire after a year. Certificates expire as well, but typically people who manage certificates know when they expire, or it's easy to see by inspecting the certificate.
Right.
But whereas a password, you have to remember that some developer created the secret on a certain date.
Yeah.
So in production scenarios, you're probably better off using certificates, and most organizations have certificate infrastructure anyways.
Right.
So it's not that much more. And they don't have to be public certs. It can be, a domain cert or self-signed, however you wish to accomplish it. But at least you have to keep that in mind. So.
Yeah, and just so people are clear too, the self-signed certs, that's not just for development. If you wanted to, you could use that for production, because all you really need is a public-private key pair. That's all you really need for this. So they're not going to be. You don't need to be in the trusted root authority or any of that kind of stuff. It really just needs to see, was it secured was it encrypted, was the token encrypted with the private key, and then does Azure AD know about it with the public?
Right. As long as you provide that cert, the self-signed cert to Azure, you control the Azure tenant, so you can say, I want to pick the self-signed cert, right?
Yeah.
And there's no user interface with the red bar, so users won't know that it's a self-signed cert instead of a public signed one. So, I generally say you're probably better off with a cert infrastructure. But if you don't have one, then you can still get away with passwords. That's fine.
Yeah.
Just don't leave them in web.config as unencrypted plain text. That kind of drives me crazy. But
And so, so now we've got we've got two different flows right now, right? We have the authorization code flow, where the scenarios where that's going to make the most sense. That's probably, I consider that the most common one because that's one people are so familiar with. That's when you go to an app, the app redirects you over to Azure. You log in over at Azure. You give the app permission to do whatever it wants to do, whatever permissions it needs for your stuff. You do delegated permissions, right? Azure AD then sends you back to the app with a authorization code, which is like a drink ticket. I have to make that analogy. It's like a drink ticket. It's not worth anything, and then the app can then take that drink ticket, the authorization code, back to Azure AD to get an access token to go talk on your behalf. That whole flow is super secure. Well, they're all secure, but that one is really secure in the sense that the user never gives the username and password to the application. It's all handled outside, but between the user and Azure AD. This flow that we just talked about a second ago, the client credential flow or the app only flow, this one is good scenarios when we want a application to act without any involvement of a user. So like a service running in the middle of the night or something, or when it needs to have higher level of permissions than what the user has access to.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yep.
So we got a third flow too that's now supported. You want to talk a little about that one that we got in March or February this year?
I will talk only a little because someone I'm sitting with uses it more often than I do. And so the what we have so far, if you think this through, so I have an application in our first flow. I have an application ID, and it talks to Azure AD, and it gets a code back, and the code is then sent along with a request to get the token, and so on and so forth. And so there's some intelligence built into the client application. And then the client credentials one, clearly our app has stored some credentials somewhere and it can prevent them, right? But now this scenario of where I'm running JavaScript in the browser, you don't have secure storage for a password or these codes, right? So that you can think that there's a kind of a risk there to use these flows in something that is not easily secured at runtime, right? And so that is why this implicit flow, and I tell you the truth, I don't even remember how they got the name implicit flow, but that's where we would use in more of a JavaScript or less secure execution environment, but still get the security of the conversation.
Right. So it basically just says we're not going to require you to have any kind of a secret for this. The user does have to log in, but the app doesn't have any kind of a login associated with it. The app simply has a ID and say, I need to be able to get access to this. Now, it's really,
which implies that you can't have the elevated privileges or app-only context in an implicit flow because how are you going to establish that context?
Delegate permissions only in this, right? Yeah. And so this is really good for the scenario when you're doing like fully client-side based solutions. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, no server-side touch point, which is very popular among. This is really designed to really support the single-page app model for building things like with Angular or Aurelia or Durandal or Ember, those different scenarios where that's the one place where we're falling down. Where before, if we wanted to do any kind of authentication that way or talk to an authenticated endpoint, we had to create an intermediary like API that our single page app would call that intermediary app that would then call the app on our behalf after it's authenticated, which is a real pain. Then it's kind of like, well, why am I doing a single page app in the first place?
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's nice that they actually they enabled this for us. And at the same time, when they add this support, they also gave us a JavaScript library, ADAL.js. So ADAL is Azure Active Directory Authentication Library.
Yep.
We have implementations for .NET, for iOS, for all these different things. And now they have a JavaScript one, which makes it really easy to use. It's designed to work with Angular, but they're working on other ones as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? So we knew about ADAL before because the library was released for .NET, but what I'm seeing now and poking around in documentation, ADAL is generally referred to as the JavaScript library, and everything else is just the SDK for whatever you're building, right? So Office 365 does a NuGet package, and you get some magic code that does Active Directory, it is still called the ADAL library, but generally when you hear ADAL, that's used in the context of JavaScript these days.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because every script library needs to have a fancy name, right?
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, you can't just have a normal one.
Not just fancy, but a cute name too.
Yeah,
like Gulp or Grunt or Q or...
Exactly. Exactly.
I get a lot of grief for that, even though I'm not really responsible for any of them.
No, I'm not giving you grief. I'm just saying it seems crazy. It doesn't sound enterprisey, that's for sure.
No, it definitely doesn't. All right, cool. So we just talked a little bit about flows here. And hey, there was something that came up, and I think it came up during the podcast, or if not, it was definitely over an email that I had with you a little bit after that, where I asked you about like how long are tokens valid.
Oh yeah.
And so you did a bunch of research, a significant amount of research into this. and did a big blog post about it as well. And I know that Vittorio even wrote about it too.
It's nice to be in the same breath as him, but his was a totally independent concept, right? So I like to refresh people on the token, right? And so when I look at a token in, say, Fiddler or the IE browser tools, whatever, it looks like gibberish, but it's an encoded string.
Yeah.
It's not encrypted, it's an encoded string. So you can get the token and you can look and see, you can decode it and then look at it. It's either XML or JSON, depending on the library you're using. And they do have a lifetime. And so, of course, I did my research and I found out Azure Active Directory, it was 64 minutes, I think, or 63 minutes, right? And then not too long ago...
That's for access tokens?
That's the access tokens from Azure Active Directory. And so, of course, then the official documentation, well, not official, but the documentation from Vittorio, who is the king of this at Microsoft. And he had a blog post, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes, I'm sure. And he said they're good for an hour. And so that extra 3 or 4 minutes, I'm sure, is for time synchronization difficulties, right? So they give you that. So the access token, you can look at it, you can see it, it's good for an hour. And then, of course, there's the refresh token. We don't have to rehash all that. But the interesting thing is the spec says the refresh token is an opaque string issued by the token issuer. Mm-hmm. And they do whatever they want. So you can't take the refresh token and decode it or anything. No. It's just a string that you don't know what it's for. Yeah. And Vittorio had noted that Azure Active Directory is issuing refresh tokens that are good for 14 days. Mm-hmm. And then the concept of refresh tokens, meaning I have an access token, right? So let's say I start an app and I get an hour and I can do as many calls as I want for an hour with that token. And then that token's expired. And so, okay, that token's expired. I have a refresh token, give me an updated access token. And when I get the updated access token, I get an updated refresh token. So I can kick that can down the road, right? Every time it hits 14 days. However, that refresh token will expire for good after 90 days.
After 90, okay.
So if you have an unattended process running on the 91st day, the refresh token won't be able to get an access token.
I see.
So you need to keep in mind that at some point you'll need to have a facility of some kind that a person with appropriate permissions in your Azure directory or Azure tenant, if you will, can have to go in through your app and then make the initial call like you did on day one to say, Paul's going to log in and give me an updated refresh token and then I can restart that 90-day clock again. So you can't just let it run for years and forget about it. You're going to have to be. So that means when you write these apps, you make sure you have good logging.
Right. So, okay, so let me make sure I understand this. So, access token, we use that to get in. That's going to be ballpark about an hour, 64 minutes to be just a little bit of a
just go with an hour,
Okay? And then refresh token is good for 14 days, right?
Yeah.
But I'm going to be able to keep reusing that refresh token or the refresh token that comes back, but I can't use that in a chain for more than 90 days.
That's correct.
Okay.
Now, so best practice, right? Every time you get an access token, you're going to get a refresh token. You should save the new one because you never know when you're going to want that, extra time, right?
Yeah, exactly. So then the other one was the authorization code, the authorization code flow. Now that one's good for a very short time, right?
Right. So that so if you remember, we talked in these flows, right? So at some point, the application has to establish its identity, and the user's establishing their identity, and that initial conversation happens. You would expect that to happen quickly, right? I click on a link, or I press a button, and I want to talk to somebody. And I need to get a token. So you can imagine that conversation shouldn't take that long. Yeah. So I don't know the lifetime of a code, but it's really not intended to be persistent for any length of time. You use it once and then it's no longer valid. So I don't know if you've seen any timeouts.
I haven't seen, I've seen timeouts. No, I haven't seen any documentation that says how long they are.
Okay.
But in my experience, they're usually somewhere around 5 to 10 minutes. Something like that, but it's pretty quick. So I usually run into it when I'm walking through that manual demo of showing the authorization code flow and doing the manual, duplicating Rob Howard's demo.
Right.
And I always tell people, it's like, we're going to get it, we're going to get the authorization code. But just to let you know, we may have to rerun this again in just a minute because I'm going to explain what we're doing along the way. And it's probably going to take me 5 or 10 minutes to get through all of this. And by the time I get there, it may have already died. So if we try this and it dies, we may come back, run this again, get a new one, and then go and jump back. So,
which makes sense because you don't want someone poking around with these codes and doing something crazy. So the short lifespan for those is good.
It's good, because that authorization code, you could use that for a lot of different things, right? So I have seen too, I guess another piece too about the token is that there's a multi-use refresh token where I can actually use that refresh token to get other access tokens, not even just the one, but for different endpoints.
Yeah, but I think that is all in the context of, let's say, Office 365 in Azure, because behind the scenes, Exchange Online's a different server than SharePoint Online. So Microsoft has this concept of multiple resources. So it makes sense in that context. But you can't take an Azure AD token for SharePoint Online and use it for SAP or some other server. No. Absolutely. But yeah. So if you think about that, that's developers' life easier, but then users' life easier too, because they're not going to make that distinction between server A and server B or endpoint 1 or endpoint 2. So that makes things a lot easier.
Absolutely. So hey, another thing that we didn't talk about last time was something called Azure AD Premium, because we have different levels, right, of Azure AD. You've got the free version, there's a basic version. You get basic with Office 365, and then you get then there's Azure AD Premium. So Azure AD, that the basic's going to give you users. It's going to give you the ability to do applications. It's going to allow you to do MFA, that kind of stuff. But what do you get with Premium? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. So I think, if I remember correctly, the basic version now might have password reset, I believe is included now. That it wasn't originally. So you get some of that management as well. And you didn't mention, but you do get groups. So I can create a group or synchronize an AD group from on-prem up into the cloud. The premium stuff, a couple of things that the big one that all us developers would love is what they call dynamic groups. So this is really just the new name of the old claims attribute-based authorization we could do back in the day. But I can say that you're a member of this group if your department attribute equals HR. So I don't have to go through, and when I add a new person to HR, I don't have to maintain the group as in a separate transaction. It can just at runtime, hey, I got Andrew, and because his value is equal to HR, he has a group membership called HR. So your code doesn't have to be claims aware. It can just say, well, if you're a member of the group called HR, you get that. So the dynamic groups is a fantastic approach, and that a lot of people are asking for that for free. So
or at least down to the basic level, right?
Exactly.
And, I mean, you can think about it too. For those of you people for those of our listeners that are old school SharePoint people, think audiences. This is a replacement for audiences where you don't have to compile the audience. This is done for you. It's a live lookup, right?
And it's intended to be a security authorization.
Unlike
audiences. And so we should go back to I said free version. You can, if you get an Azure tenant, you get a directory for free, right? So you don't necessarily, and you can get what you get with Office 365 is the basic one, right? So but then this premium one has that exactly, and then a lot of people love that. It's really pretty cool.
Reporting, the reporting capabilities that we have in it too,
right. And so they understand that people want to do, like, you could do auditing, right? So a lot of people want to know who's logging in or who's doing what. So there are some basic reports that you get with Azure AD Premium to cover who's changing passwords. Sometimes you want to make sure if someone's changing the password often, what's going on there, or and login activities, password fails, right? And I don't know if it is included yet, but you can imagine how certainly behind the scenes, Azure is looking at these logs and doing their machine learning. That's how they kind of detect malicious attempts or denial of service attempts against your tenancy as well. So a lot of that stuff, you get access to a bunch of that stuff with the Azure AD Premium.
I've seen some of the stuff that they have is where you can. It does a check to see, like, it does. There was a session at the Build conference where a guy went, or Ignite, one of the two, where a guy was explaining 10 different things that you get with AD Premium, and like it was also stuff like what was it? You were able to it could detect that when, like, if you logged in, you were in California, and 5 minutes later you tried to log in again from Florida, and it's like there's just no way you can do that. You can't make so. The geography, like,
right, exactly. So they're doing all that on our behalf. So some of that, and there are, I recently ran across the inside your Office 365 administration portal. There are some user-based reports there as well that are separate from the premium reports, so you can certainly get those as well. And then the other big one I think that organizations are going to love is you can, if you have Azure AD Premium, you can configure it to ping your on-prem ADFS servers and let you know if, for example, they're not responding, right? So to fill that in, right? If I'm a large organization, I have my directory on premises, and I'm typically going to synchronize up to the cloud. We can talk about that. And then, but in addition, I won't necessarily put passwords in the cloud. I'll say, hey, Azure, when someone tries to log in, redirect them to my on-prem federated identity servers and let me control the login process myself. But if that is down, people can't log in.
Yeah.
And so being able to monitor, so most people would monitor themselves, but this is a nice feature that says, it gives me a whole single place to think of my identity story in the cloud because I'm Azure AD, and then it'll come up there. And if you think about it, let's say I have my outage is a network outage, my monitoring servers might be on the same network. So how do I actually check something? So you get kind of this external, someone knocking at the door to make sure that the health of your federation servers are up. And so that's
which is pretty
cool.
critical. I mean, you don't want that to get out of sync. And,
exactly.
Especially it gets out of sync and things aren't working. You can get a false sense of security that things are working when it's just for some people it's not, though.
Or if they're down, no one can log in. So you have content Office 365 that it's very secure. No one can get to it.
Very locked down.
Dead in the water. And so that health monitoring is part of a new service now, or offering, I should call it, right? Called Azure AD Connect. And so those of us who've been around for a while, we had Sync.
Yeah.
And then you had Azure AD Sync, and now it's called Azure AD Connect. And it just went, I would say GA, but, or released to web or whatever. So it's now out of preview within the last 4 weeks or so, I would imagine, sometime in June or May. And that is, so it's the sync tool, and think about it, it's still a derivative of FIM, which is Federated Identity Manager. It's the same thing we did for user profile synchronization.
Oh boy,
right?
you could bring up the bad stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, obviously, it's much better. It works better. And what's really new about it, they really have, the wizard I think had 5 screens, and the first one says, "Hi, I'm a wizard, click next." And I may be off by 1 or 2, but it's much simpler. They're only, the default profile is only sync the attributes I need up in the cloud. If you're not doing Exchange Online, you don't need a bunch of AD attributes up there, so you can keep all that information. You can choose whether to hash passwords and store the hashes in the cloud, or use ADFS and put no password in the cloud. It's really straightforward to do, and then you can always rerun the wizard to update your configuration. It remembers what you've done before. It's a nice. It just works, and so it's a much better experience. And then of course you can then configure that Azure AD Health monitoring in Premium using that tool as well. So as you set up your synchronization, then you can also say, hey, I want you also to monitor what's going on here, and you get without it, you get the basic, your synchronization failed, or Joe user didn't get synced because some attribute was invalid. But in addition, you get the monitoring. So it's really pretty slick. And so if you, obviously there's no urgency to put in, if you've got it running, sync still syncs, that's great. But if you're new to the area, the Azure AD Connect is going to be the tool that you will use instead of DirSync.
Yeah. Oh, cool. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Hey, so I know a couple of things that you stumbled upon that are absolute gold mines. We were looking at this before we started up this interview here, and you found 2 really good documents.
So a little bit of, I know where you're going, right? So a little bit. So we had a panel today, and you can hear some of that panel on Jeremy's podcast. But
Jeremy thinks Office 365 Developer Podcast.
Yeah. So and so someone asked the question about where do I go to learn this stuff, right? And my response was Office 365. Back in the day, you had the SharePoint SDK because everything was there. Well, now we're not all SharePoint, and so Azure Active Directory, I go to the Azure and click the documentation link, and hey, look at this, there's the developer thing. So there's a site called aka.ms/AADDEV, so Azure AD Dev. This is just a shortcut link that Microsoft published, which is the Azure Active Directory Developers Guide, and it takes you to their documentation page for everything Azure AD.
Yeah.
And so, and it's pretty substantial, and they cover the concepts. It covers the synchronizing. It covers, what's in the directory. All the things we talked about are there. My favorite, though, which we probably mentioned this, but we were talking flows. They actually have sequence diagrams and flow charts that explain these flows for you in much detail, and they give you scenarios. And so, a scenario might be: I have a web page that wants to talk to a secured resource like SharePoint Online. So here's how you do this flow. Yeah. Or you're doing a single page app and I need to connect to SharePoint Online. So here's how I do that flow. Or I have a native device app, a Windows app or an iOS app, and I need to connect and so on. Yeah. Even so far as I have a web page or I have a browser that's connecting to a web app that I wrote that's secured by Azure AD, and my web app is connecting to a web API service that's secured by Azure AD as well. So you can imagine that passing tokens back and forth can be a little bit complicated. They have it all spelled out,
really
with a
good
sequence diagram, and then annotated with the steps that are happening, and of course links to samples. And just like dev.office.com has samples, they have got samples that cover all the different auth scenarios and all the different platforms, and open it up and press F5 and you're 99% of the way there. So it's really pretty substantial. And again, the key thing is we're not using SharePoint for auth. We're using Azure AD, so let's go to the source and get their documentation.
Yeah, I tell you, when you pull these articles up, first of all, the sequence diagrams are really, really useful to show the flows, how the flows go. But the other part that is really impressive is that all those samples. I mean, there's that one page. There's one page that we're going to link to these in the show notes. But man, when you sit and you start scrolling through all the different samples that are there, it is ridiculous how many samples they've got listed there. You can go grab all the code straight from their GitHub account, their GitHub organization. They're all under the Azure AD Samples org on Azure AD. It's nuts. How much stuff
it is great. And just the one sample I like is this one. They call it the web app web API OAuth 2 app identity. It's a big long name, but but the point of that is what they're showing you is that you have a web service and you secure the web service. And then you have a web app that calls that service, but the web app should be secured as well. So you're securing the service, you're securing the app, you're communicating between the two. Yeah. They're all in Azure Active Directory. So there's some shortcuts you get, like you said, your multi-resource refresh token that's all covered in there. And then they have sometimes you authenticate a user using OpenID Connect, which is identity on top of OAuth, and sometimes you're using legacy WS-Fed SAML tokens. So they've got both of those protocols covered, and then you have single tenant or multi-tenant, right? So they really, if you think all the permutations, we're 2 to the 4th power already, right? And it gets crazy. So all those different things. And then they have the platforms, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's samples there for Node. There's samples there for iOS.
Yeah. So if you're at all interested in what's going on under the covers, start those, download those, you hit the repos, either fork them or just download them and run those and see. And then when you're going through into your application, you have at least a reference to go through. And all those MVC ones use OWIN the right way.
Not with our first initial explanations.
Man,
that's cool. Great resources, though.
Yeah, and of course, there's always cloudidentity.com, which is the blog of Vittorio Bartucci. I don't know how he pronounced his last name, but Vittorio is a native Italian and just the master of all things identity in Azure.
He makes OAuth sound sexy.
Yeah. You know what I really like about it is when he does a diagram on his blog, it's hand drawn.
It's all drawn with his
which is as creative as I could ever be, right? So I love his drawings. And I did exchange emails years ago and say, I love your drawings. Can I use them? But he goes, absolutely.
He's it's really good. He's really approachable. It's really fun to talk to, and it's easy. It's really easy to understand when he goes to explain stuff. He does a really good job of explaining this, and he really makes it seem like it's really simple. I mean, this stuff gets complicated as heck really fast, right? You can really get it over your head pretty quick. But if you really just slow down and understand just little bits and pieces of it, and then start to see where all the possibilities are, it's hard to get your brain wrapped around it. But once you do, it's really powerful stuff.
And the moral of the story, there's no reason not to secure your stuff, right? Security by obscurity isn't enough. And I'm behind the firewall, as Scott told us earlier today, it doesn't necessarily wash because there's risks everywhere. So there's no reason not to be doing this. If Azure AD is already in your organization, it is super simple to just enable this stuff. And you spend a day or two researching, and who's not going to say okay, right?
I mean, and the cost of it is so low, if not zero, right, for a lot of organizations.
And compared to the cost of exposure, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, but then all the other identity products that we used to have to buy and actually configure and everything, there's so many more features to this, plus it's free, plus it's cloud hosted, so you have to maintain it. I mean, I had somebody in my session today where they were saying, well, I can't do any of this stuff because I'm on-prem. I'm like, do you have an Office 365 subscription? He's like, no, but we have an Azure subscription. I'm like, well, you can actually go through and set this up. You could take advantage of all of this by creating an Azure subscription, by going through and setting up Azure AD Connect, go through and synchronize your directory. Then you can have applications in Azure AD. You can use these different flows, secure your own apps that way. And you can have a custom app and put all your users inside of Azure AD, and you don't worry about securing passwords. I feel much more comfortable with somebody like Microsoft protecting their infrastructure, going and worrying about people trying to hack their infrastructure with Azure AD than anything that I'm going to spend trying to maintain my databases. So
absolutely, and and you mentioned about third party. So all these protocols, by the way, OAuth and OpenID Connect and WS-Fed, those are industry standards. So if you have a third party tool on-prem, Ping does identity, Oracle does identity. You don't have to throw those away.
Yeah.
If you want to have a cloud-based identity, you can do that in Azure AD. And I know Amazon has a directory service. I admit I don't know it as well as Azure, but I'm sure they have these. They're going to compete on features at some point.
Yep.
So all these concepts certainly apply to any cloud-hosted identity management system. And that's what I would say. Azure AD isn't really a directory. It's identity management in the cloud.
Yeah.
And it really can help you a lot.
And they're innovating on it like crazy.
Yeah.
There's always something new with it. It's really cool. I definitely take a look at the blog, the Azure AD blog. Alex Simmons writes a lot for them too.
Yeah.
And has a ton. They're always releasing something new about it. Like, I mean, we didn't even touch the whole application proxy that you can do.
Oh,
so.
That's really cool. You got to get Kirk Evans on to talk about that.
I'm trying to get him back on the show to talk about.
Lure him in with that proxy, but then spring a bunch of SharePoint questions on him.
Yeah, I think he'd actually like that.
Yeah, I think he would too. Hi, Kirk.
Awesome. Well, hey man, you got anything else you want to throw out here with us, or?
I just wrapped up a very busy month of community events.
Oh my God, did you ever?
Yeah, but fortunately, half of them were in Chicago, so it wasn't all so bad, and a couple of them were combined with client trips, so it's not like I went out of my way. But I'll be doing SP TechCon again in Boston in August.
I'll see you there.
Yeah, and then again in November at the SP Live conference, I'm doing a half a day or I'm doing a full day workshop on identity. So surprise. So and I have, since we're talking here, just realized I should probably just throw away my deck and start fresh about a month ahead of time, because who knows what the service will look like by the time that comes around, because they innovate so fast.
I know, it's like I don't even. There's some of the things I'm talking about at some of these conferences. It's like I'm not going to build any decks or anything until about a month out, because then it's like then stuff is going to, and you tweak. I've been doing one session on Node.js recently, and I think it's the 5th time I've given this talk in the last month and a half, and it's the 5th time I've had to update it.
Yep.
And one night before I gave the presentation at I think Ignite, I updated it the night before the session, and then I woke up and something had changed overnight as well, so I had to change it that morning as well. I was like,
Perfect.
You gotta be kidding me.
Perfect. Yeah.
Awesome.
But I mean, that's the world you live in. But that's the thing.
It's a good thing, though.
But that kind of begs out the question. I had a question come up today, right? And so, like, my Office 365 they're versioning their API endpoints, right? So that as the service grows, you get some reliability. Azure AD is still. Well, I think it's kind of slowing down now. It has been kind of crazy in the past as they're revving it up. So that's something, the little cautionary tale to make sure you understand what's going on here and subscribe to these blogs, because I'm sure at some point the endpoints will be stable and you don't have to worry about it changing your code. But just be aware that it's a rapidly moving space, and you might want to just keep an eye on things.
Yeah, a lot of innovation really fast.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks, Paul. Thanks for taking a few minutes to sit down.
Glad to be back again. A long-time listener, as they say, right? And so I'm happy to be on again. And
give it another 6 months. We might probably have to do another update with all the stuff they're coming out with.
Well, we were next to the pool. We just get some margaritas. I'm good to go, right?
There we go.
Yeah,
Sounds good. Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Paul.
All right.
If you have a question for us, go to microsoftcloudshow.com/questions, where you can submit it as text or record it as a WAV or an MP3 file and provide a link so that we can play your question on the show. Our theme music is an excerpt from Evaporated Eric by Monk Turner, used under Creative Commons. You can subscribe to us in iTunes by searching for the Microsoft Cloud Show or via RSS at microsoftcloudshow.com, where you'll also find a full transcript and show notes of each episode. You can find us on Facebook searching for the Microsoft Cloud Show, or on Twitter at MS Cloud Show. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.